So while we're waiting God knows how long for more information about the KOTOR remake, I want to try and branch into other Star Wars games as seamlessly as possible. And this is a little bit of news for a Star Wars game that has seemingly gone under the radar, but it actually gets me very excited. Now, I don't actually remember the first Star Wars game I ever played. But out of the 2 or 3 Star Wars games that it could have been back when I was about 3 or 4 years old in the late 90s, it was very likely Dark Forces and then its sequel Jedi Knight Dark Forces 2. Dark Forces was the first ever Star Wars first-person shooter. They were inspired by Doom, so much so that the game was called a Doom clone, and it introduced a fan favourite from the Star Wars Expanded Universe, Kyle Katarn, who would go on to play a big role in all of its sequels such as Jedi Knight, Jedi Academy, and Jedi Knight Jedi Outcast. But it all started with Dark Forces in 1995, which kind of seems to go a little bit forgotten in comparison to the other games. Jedi Knight Jedi Outcast and Jedi Knight Jedi Academy are widely regarded as the pinnacle of the series, but they are very different games to the original Dark Forces. Because while those games were all about Jedi and Jedi issues, Dark Forces was about a rebel who infiltrates a base and gets the Death Star plans in what was the original Rogue One. It was all blasters, stormtroopers, dark troopers, infiltration, subterfuge. You couldn't even use a lightsaber in the original game. And it does hold a very important place in my heart, along with many other classic Star Wars games that I did used to play as a child on an old PC. Now, if you're unaware, there are a number of Star Wars games currently being developed right now. Companies like Ubisoft, Quantum Dream, EA, Saber, they're all working on Star Wars titles, and Respawn Entertainment are one of the core studios that are in the process of making Star Wars games. They are of course known for making Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order and its upcoming sequel Jedi Survivor, but they are in development of 2 other Star Wars games as well as Jedi Survivor. They are producing a Star Wars strategy game which is being developed by a company called Bit Reactor, which is rumoured to be very much like XCOM but Star Wars edition. And they themselves are developing in-house a Star Wars first-person shooter. Now this was all announced about a year or so ago, and we haven't heard anything about either game since then in terms of officially publicised news. And at the time of that announcement, Peter Hirschman, who is leading the FPS project, and was actually the former vice president of development at LucasArts back in the day, said that this first-person shooter was a story he always wanted to tell. He absolutely loved working with people at Lucasfilm all those years ago on things like Battlefront and Force Unleashed, and that he found inspiration in the Dark Forces games too. But a few days ago, Respawn officially put up a job listing for a cinematic lead for their Star Wars FPS, in which the Dark Forces games were explicitly mentioned as their inspiration for it. Not only that, but the game is supposedly heavily story-driven, and it will be the first Star Wars game to utilise Unreal Engine 5. And I say that assuming that it will release before the KOTOR remake, because as far as I'm aware, the KOTOR remake also used Unreal Engine 5. This is the specific wording verbatim. In collaboration with Lucasfilm, the Star Wars FPS team is developing a new AAA FPS in the Star Wars galaxy. Inspired by classic titles like Dark Forces and Jedi Knight Dark Forces 2, our story-driven single-player game is being developed from the ground up, leveraging the power of Unreal Engine 5. So in this current age of remakes, it's not too far-fetched to consider that maybe this isn't inspired by Dark Forces, but is actually a Dark Forces remake. However, I actually think it's going to be some kind of spiritual successor. There are of course a number of Star Wars first-person shooters out there, and to have the words Dark Forces explicitly stated on a job listing is quite eye-catching. They could have easily said inspired by Star Wars first-person shooters like Dark Forces, Republic Commando, Star Wars Battlefront, etc., but they explicitly and only stated Dark Forces and Dark Forces 2. Now, will it introduce Kyle Katarn back into Star Wars canon? I don't know, maybe. And if they brought him back into canon, I imagine changing the story would be quite divisive, but who knows. Now sadly, unlike the KOTOR remake, I'm not on any friendship terms with anybody who works directly at Respawn. I was very fortunate to know some people at Aspyr at the time, however I have heard that all of Respawn's Star Wars games are supposedly centered around the time frame of Jedi Fallen Order. So with that said, there is a possibility that it may be Kyle Katarn related, because it is supposedly going to be set within that time period of the Galactic Empire. And when I was told this, it made a lot of sense to me. From the very little information I could gather about it, it's their own little pocket of the Star Wars universe that they want to work in with their games. However, do take that with a very heavy grain of salt. As I said, my knowledge in this situation is very limited in comparison to what it was with the KOTOR remake at the time. And for any of you that are going to consider typing in the comments saying, "Luke, do you have any updates about the KOTOR remake?" Unfortunately, I don't. I haven't heard anything. Not only do I have absolutely zero contacts within Saber, although I certainly wish I did. Aspyr had a mass exodus of employees, and I really don't know what's going on over there anymore either. Besides the things I was told at the back end of last year regarding their future Star Wars remake plans, and the KOTOR 2 DLC, which still isn't out yet, and they still haven't even mentioned it. So before you ask me about that too, I have no clue. God knows what's going on with that. Now, I am a little bit surprised. I honestly thought if they were going to be inspired by any first-person shooter, it would have been Republic Commando. Not only have they been introducing clone commandos and stuff in the Bad Batch, like Scorch for example, but when it comes to gaming, your target audience is really in its 20s, early 30s, and so it would have made more sense to have a game that was targeting people in their 20s like myself, who grew up with Republic Commando and not Dark Forces. Truthfully, the only reason that I played Dark Forces as a kid was because my dad owned the game in the 90s. It's also safe to assume that we'll probably be using lightsabers and whatnot in this game too. Jedi Knight Dark Forces 2 introduced lightsabers, and Dark Forces 2 was the other game mentioned in this job listing. Now, I have a question that I really want you guys to answer. What was the first Star Wars game you ever played? Like I said, I can't pinpoint the exact one it was for me. It was either Dark Forces 1 or 2, or it was Rogue Squadron or the Phantom Menace video game. And I'm really curious to see what the first Star Wars game you ever played was. So let me know down in the comment section below. As always, don't forget to like the video if you did enjoy it. It helps me out a great deal. And maybe share this video so this news can go out a little bit. Like I said, literally no outlets or journalists have picked this up, which surprises me because I loved the Dark Forces games, and I'm sure many of you guys loved the Jedi Knight games in general. So it excites me, and it should be exciting more Star Wars fans. And if you haven't, perhaps consider subscribing to join the biggest growing Knights of the Old Republic community on YouTube. I'll see you guys in the next video. But until then, may the Force be with you. Always.